Welcome to MotoringBox. Today, we're looking at one of the largest sedans ever built in Australia, the Ford NC Fairlane. But first, we're going to go back in time. The Fairlane name might be familiar to some North American viewers, as a model sold by Ford there from 1955 to 1970. The American Fairlane was introduced into the Australian market in 1959 and was assembled locally using kits sourced from Ford of Canada. This continued through until 1967, when Ford of Australia released their new locally developed Fairlane. The ZA was based on the Australian XR Falcon of the time and sat above it as a sort of longer wheelbased, more luxury-orientated model. This proved to be a winning formula, and Ford Australia continued to offer the Fairlane version alongside every Falcon model which followed. The ZB, ZC, ZD, ZF, ZG, ZH, ZJ, ZK, ZL, and finally the NA Fairlane of 1989 were not only longer than the Falcon models in which they were based, but also had their own unique styling while sharing almost all of the same mechanical components. Now this brings us through to the NC Fairlane, which is introduced by Ford of Australia in 1991. Now one very important upgrade that came with the NC Fairlane was the return of the mighty 302 Windsor V8. Now the reason I say important is because the last time a Falcon or a Fairlane ever came with a V8 in Australia was back in 1982, when it was dropped because of the whole fuel crisis that was going on at the time. Now this car sold brand new in the 90s for $41,000, which is about $75,000 in today's money. There was also an LTD version which had a leather interior and a few other trinkets which sold at the time for $55,000, or about $100,000 in today's money. That's a lot of cash to pay for what was essentially working class luxury. And as a result, Ford only sold about 14,000 NC Fairlanes and about 1,800 DC LTDs. But enough about that. Let's take a look at this NC Fairlane, my NC Fairlane, and see what makes it unique. Now the first thing I want to talk about is the sheer size of this thing. The NC Fairlane measures in at more than 5.2 meters. That's over 17 feet long. No other Fairlane before it or since were any longer. And in fact, I'm really struggling to think of any Australian built car which was any longer. If you know of one, let me know in the comments below. But let's go beyond the NC Fairlane's size and look at its styling. Now, ever since I saw one of these back in the 1990s as a boy, I've always been a fan of how they looked. And when this one came up for sale, I simply had to have it. The sort of squared off yet rounded American styling, with its wide headlights and front grille arrangement, the full wraparound chrome body mouldings, and the blacked out B and C pillars which provided one of perhaps the earliest examples of what manufacturers nowadays refer to as a floating roofline. As a piece of 1990s automotive styling, I think it looks great, but it isn't all smooth sailing. Now let's see if you can spot something wrong here. No? How about now? That's right. This long wheelbase luxury limousine has incredibly small rear doors. It's kind of one of those things that you can't unsee after you've seen it. Now this is because the Fairlane shares its doors with the shorter wheelbase Falcon on which it's based. And when Ford of Australia was lengthening the body, they simply added it here. Now this allowed Ford of Australia to set the rear seats a little bit further back for increased legroom. And their small size doesn't really affect the operation. There's an incredible amount of space here and you can still get in and out extremely easily. But when it comes to looks, you decide. Next up, we'll talk engines. Now the Fairlane was available with an Australian developed 4-litre straight 6, but it could also be optioned with a 5-litre Windsor V8. But if you think that Ford borrowed it from the Mustang in the States, you'd be wrong. Now whether it was for cost or durability's sake, the Windsor V8 engine offered in the Fairlane was actually imported from Canada, where it was used in all of Ford's F-Truck models. In order to fit this engine into the Australian Fairlane, the inlet manifold had to be reversed for right-hand drive packaging reasons, and this meant the rest of the air inlet and many of the belt-driven accessories are also on the opposite side of the engine bay compared to left-hand drive Eagles. The 5-litre V8 developed adequate power for the time, 165 kilowatts, and 388 Newton meters of torque, which was all sent to the rear wheels via a BTR 4-speed automatic transmission. There are cars with 4-cylinder turbocharged engines today which absolutely destroy this thing in terms of power and fuel economy. Plus, if you're stuck in stop-start city traffic, you can expect things to get much, much worse. Now, there was one other thing which I thought was quite interesting. You'll notice there are 2 air ducts here on the front of the engine bay. Now, the first one here runs to the airbox and then into the engine. Nothing strange about that. But the second one is actually for the battery. The battery has its own air inlet and shroud to protect it from all of the heat circulating around inside the engine bay. Now, I'm sure there are probably other vehicles out there which have something similar, but this is the first time I've ever seen it, and I think it's pretty cool. Now, the main drawcard for the Fairlane has always been interior space, and in that regard, it does not disappoint. There is simply an insane amount of space in this car. Inside, you'll find a full velour interior with lounge-style front seats, and one of the most comfortable and deeply padded rear seats I've ever experienced. The amount of legroom back here is also pretty amazing. I'm around 6'1", and with the driver's seat positioned to my liking, there's still a huge amount of space back here for a second person of my size, and more. But apart from the comfort and the space, passengers here don't get a lot else. There's a fold-down centre armrest, a map light on each side, a lovely strip of actual lacquered wood, electric windows, and an ashtray for your cigarette. Up front, the wooden velour theme continues, except you'll notice there aren't any electric window switches on the door. That's because Ford decided to put them down here on the centre console, completely unlabelled. If you stab away at them, you'll soon work out that the outer 2 switches control the front windows, the inner 2 control the rear, and the centre switch locks out the rear window controls for backseat passengers. You'll also notice that the driver's window is auto down, and it achieves this by physically holding down the switch until the window reaches the bottom. The NC Fairlane also shares its entire dashboard with the ED Falcon on which it was based, and as a result they look largely the same. The NC Fairlane, however, did receive a few upgrades. For a start, the Fairlane gained a semi-digital instrument cluster which is quite unique. The speed and mileage figures are displayed on old-school LCD displays, exactly like that calculator you used back in primary school, while the tachometer, fuel and temperature gauges remain analogue. But perhaps the most interesting thing is over on the left. Now, it was typical for most cars of the 90s to have a generic warning light which would illuminate whenever a door was left open or not closed properly. But the NC Fairlane goes one step further and actually provides you with a dedicated diagram of the car and shows you exactly which door is open at any given time. And this also includes the boot or trunk and even the fuel flap. To me, it is crazy that Ford would dedicate so much space on the cluster for this information, but well, they did. Moving across, and you'll find the Fairlane's automatic climate controls. Both the air conditioning and heater on this car are incredibly powerful, and they can be set to your liking by simply adjusting the temperature up or down, and the computer handles the rest. Most of the other controls are spelt out in English, although curiously, Ford decided to hide some of the more specific ventilation options under this little spring-loaded door. Next, we have the trip computer, and I know what you're thinking. How ridiculous does this thing look? I'd say people back in the 90s probably weren't even impressed by this. Firstly, you have your instant fuel economy, which will show you the Fairlane's fuel thirst in real time. But I wouldn't recommend using this because the figures you'll see will truly shock you. In daily driving, it'll swing anywhere from 8 to 99 litres per 100 kilometres. That's a range of 29 mpg down to just 2 mpg. Slightly less alarming is the average fuel economy, average speed and range remaining figures. But perhaps the funniest thing on this entire vehicle is revealed when you go to set the date and time. Here, you've got the hours and minutes as usual, and then you need to set the year. But hey, it's 2018 now, so let's sort this out. So you press search to increase the year until you reach 1999. But there's a problem. Now at this point, I bet you're thinking, aha, the next year is going to be 1900 because of the whole Y2K year 2000 bug, right? Well, you'd be wrong. It's 1972. I mean, who signed off on the design of this unit? For a car that went on sale just 7 years before the year 2000, it's absolutely crazy. Moving down, you'll see that this Fairlane still retains the existing factory stereo. And at the time, I'm sure it was all very impressive. There's certainly no faulting the sound quality. It's great even by today's standards. There are 8 speakers in total and a subwoofer on the rear parcel shelf. And the head unit itself offers FM radio and cassette tape options as you'd expect for the time period, plus access to up to 6 CDs loaded into the stacker in the rear of the vehicle. Well, that's about all there is to look at in here, so let's take the big Fairlane out for a drive. Okay, driving the NC Fairlane. Well, if you thought this car looked big on the outside, it feels even bigger from in here, to be honest. Despite its size, the NC Fairlane isn't as heavy as you'd expect. It weighs in at around 1,600 kilograms or around 3,500 pounds. For a car of this size, it's actually pretty good. Not that it really helps fuel economy or performance though. Now, a V8 NC Fairlane will do 0 to 100 in about 8 seconds on a crest of clutch fan noise, and probably drink a couple of dollars worth of petrol in the process. But once you get up to highway speeds, things do kind of even out a little bit. Cruising along at about 100 kilometers an hour, you could probably expect 10 litres per 100 kilometers. For what it is, the V8 produces pretty decent torque. Not a lot of power, but the torque is there, which is pretty useful when you've only got 4 gears to play with. And off the line, it's pretty slow, really. But the gearbox does have 2 shift settings. There's an economy setting, which is pretty much normal, and power, which does let the RPMs go a little bit higher and shift a little bit firmer. Big Australian Fords like the Falcon and the Fairlane really feel at home on these sort of undulating 100-kilometre-hour Australia country roads. They sort of waft along and soak up all of the undulations and potholes in the road, but also they're kind of stiff enough to inspire you in the corners with a little bit of confidence. It's certainly not like one of those old American Cadillacs where they kind of lean into the corners like a boat. It's actually, for what it is, handles pretty well. The seats, they're pretty much as comfortable as your sofa is at home, and it's really good for sort of long distance trips. At speed, the engine itself is also pretty quiet. Most of the time it almost sounds like it's running on air, even though the trip computer assures you that that is simply not the case. But while you're wafting along at speed, there's one thing you should probably keep in the back of your mind, and that is that the Fairlane has no safety equipment of any kind, really. There are no airbags, there's no traction control, stability management. It does, however, have ABS, except for the times when it doesn't. So get comfortable, just not too comfortable. Safety features aside though, I think the NC Fairlane is the perfect car for those who are looking for a piece of Australiana that they can cruise along in comfort and style without costing too much money. And like me, if it sounds like you, then you can't really go wrong. Well, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, share, comment, subscribe, anything you want. If you've got any questions about the Fairlane, hit me up in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.
Sometimes I'm so home. Sometimes I know I'm so home. Sometimes I'm so home. Sometimes I know I'm so
and becoming the best at it and mastering myself and seeing what I have within me If you decide to drop your buckets where you are and develop your gifts, I grant you, you'll never ever be without. I grant you that your gifts will take you places that will literally amaze you.